Rowan Hale walked into the marble-floored living room of the Weatherby estate, wearing a jacket worn thin at the elbows and boots still dusted with garage grime. Nobody rose to greet him. Conrad Weatherby smirked and called the single father the greatest disappointment his late sister had ever brought into the family. Lucinda suggested the lawyer skip ahead and hand Rowan whatever small mercy the will contained so he could leave. Rowan said nothing. He simply took a seat at the back of the room, holding a locked wooden box his father-in-law had once placed in his hands. When the will was finally read aloud, the entire family fell silent. The old man had left control of the empire to Rowan Hale. If you want to know why the man everyone dismissed walked away holding the keys to an empire, stay through to the end and remember to subscribe to the channel. The morning had begun quietly in a small house behind a repair garage in the coastal town of Ashford Bay, where Rowan made breakfast for his 10-year-old daughter before driving her to school. Tessa already knew her father was heading to her late grandfather's estate, and she asked, in the plain way children ask difficult questions, whether the family there would call him a failure again. Rowan did not deny it. He told her that a man's worth did not change because of what a room full of strangers decided to say about him. Before she climbed out of the truck, Tessa pressed a small star-shaped paperclip into his palm and told him it would remind him to come home on time. Rowan drove the old pickup past a long line of polished sedans already parked outside the Weatherby estate, the engine ticking loudly in the sudden quiet of a driveway more accustomed to luxury imports than working trucks, and for a moment he wondered if he belonged anywhere near that driveway at all. A member of the household staff initially refused him entry because his name did not appear on the approved guest list, until Rowan produced a handwritten letter carrying Augustus Weatherby's own signature. Inside, the family and the company's senior leadership had gathered in mourning clothes that cost more than Rowan's truck, and the conversation in every corner of the room circled back to shares, properties, and who would run things next. Conrad spotted him first and asked, loudly enough for half the room to hear, whether Rowan had come looking for help paying his daughter's tuition. Lucinda added that their father had grown soft in his final years, and had a habit of extending charity to people who had done nothing to deserve it. Rowan did not argue with either of them. He simply stated that Augustus had personally invited him in a letter written before his death, and asked to be allowed to stay. Helena Quill, the family's longtime attorney, confirmed that his name appeared in a private set of instructions left by the deceased, a fact that visibly irritated Conrad. When Conrad asked what was inside the wooden box under Rowan's arm, Rowan answered simply that it held what Augustus wanted the whole family to see once the will had been read. The room itself seemed built to remind visitors of their place in the family hierarchy, with portraits of past Weatherby patriarchs lining the walls and a chandelier that threw fractured light across marble floors, polished to a mirror shine. And Rowan noticed that even the furniture near the back of the room seemed less comfortable than the seating reserved for family, as though the house itself had absorbed decades of quiet ranking and judgment. He recognized several of the executives from years earlier, men who had once nodded politely to him on construction sites before learning he no longer carried a company badge, and he watched their eyes slide past him now the way people avoid looking at something they would rather not explain. A member of the household staff offered him a drink, and he declined, choosing instead to keep both hands resting on the wooden box in his lap, as if it were the only steady thing in the entire house. Before Helena could begin, the family was asked to sign attendance records confirming their presence, and Conrad used the delay to publicly humiliate the man he considered an outsider. He reminded everyone that Rowan once had a promising career as a structural engineer, only to abandon it after his wife's death, retreating to a small town to fix engines and patch roofs instead of building an empire of his own, and he made a point of describing the garage in detail: the oil-stained concrete, the hand-painted sign, the single mechanic's bay, as though listing its modest dimensions somehow proved a larger truth about the man standing inside it. He asked, with theatrical concern, whether Rowan ever regretted trading a corner office for a life spent underneath other people's vehicles, and several relatives laughed softly. The kind of laughter that costs nothing and asks for nothing in return, except the comfort of feeling superior for a moment. A real man, Conrad insisted, turned grief into ambition rather than hiding from it in a repair shop. Lucinda picked up where her brother left off, reminding the room that their late sister, Elise Weatherby Hale, once had every advantage of privilege available to her, and chose instead to marry a man with nothing. In her telling, that marriage had pulled Elise away from her family and cost her a future she should have had. Rowan absorbed the attack without flinching, understanding that they still blamed him for a life Elise had chosen for herself rather than the one they had planned for her. A few of the executives chuckled when Conrad speculated aloud that Rowan might walk away with an old wristwatch or a small sum barely enough to cover his debts. Gideon Ashbourne, introduced as an advisor to Conrad, stepped forward with practiced sympathy and offered to purchase whatever modest shares Rowan might inherit, suggesting a man living in a small house had no business managing anything belonging to the Weatherby family. Rowan asked, quite plainly, why an outsider was so eager to buy shares before the will had even been read, and the question briefly rattled Gideon's composure before Conrad cut in to change the subject. He finally asked everyone to take their seats, explaining that the document was longer than expected and carried several binding conditions. Conrad claimed the chair at the center of the room with the confidence of a man who already considered the matter settled, while Rowan chose the last seat by the door. Helena opened with the first line Augustus had written for the occasion, stating that if everyone in the room had arranged themselves according to the power they believed they deserved, then the person most deserving was likely sitting farthest from him. Every eye in the room turned toward the back and settled on Rowan. Helena began with the smaller, personal bequests, her voice steady and unhurried despite the tension gathering in the room with every clause. Lucinda received the family's art collection, though she was barred from selling any piece for 10 years, a restriction that visibly annoyed her since she had spent the previous week privately discussing potential buyers with an auction house representative, certain the paintings would finally give her the independent fortune she had always wanted separate from her father's approval. Conrad received several personal properties, including a Manhattan apartment and the family's coastal retreat. Grandchildren and extended relatives each received trust funds bound by specific conditions of their own. For nearly 20 minutes, Rowan's name did not appear once, and Conrad grew visibly more confident with every passing clause, whispering to a cousin that their father had finally come to his senses about outsiders receiving anything of value. Then Helena moved into the corporate holdings, and the tone in the room shifted. Augustus had not left direct voting shares to either Conrad or Lucinda. Instead, every share of control had been placed into a specially created entity called the Weatherby Stewardship Trust. Whoever managed that trust would hold the power to appoint or remove the chief executive, to block the sale of core assets, to control the controlling block of shares, to approve any transaction exceeding $1 billion, and to select the family's successor in leadership. Conrad rose from his chair and demanded that Helena name the person entrusted with that authority. Helena looked toward the back of the room and read the words exactly as Augustus had written them, naming Rowan Hale as the sole manager of the Weatherby Stewardship Trust. The room went completely silent. Conrad insisted it had to be a clerical error. Lucinda declared that their father must have been manipulated during a period of serious illness. Gideon immediately asked whether Rowan had pressured a dying man into signing away his family's legacy. Rowan himself was stunned, aware that Augustus had trusted him, but never once mentioning any trust bearing his name. Helena clarified that control was not automatically granted. Rowan would first need to satisfy 3 conditions Augustus had written into the will, and failure to meet any one of them would send control directly to Conrad. Conrad smiled again, certain that a repair shop owner could never survive a single test of corporate judgment. Before revealing the conditions, Helena played a recorded message Augustus had left behind, and through his own voice, the hidden history between Rowan and the Weatherby family slowly came into focus. 13 years earlier, Rowan had been a young engineer working on a port construction project for Weatherby Crown Industries when he discovered the design had been quietly stripped of critical materials to cut costs, a shortcut that could have led to serious structural failure. His superiors ordered him to stay quiet, and, when he refused, his name was placed on a list for termination. Elise, then overseeing the project's internal audit, believed him and helped carry the evidence directly to her father. The design was corrected before construction resumed, sparing the company a catastrophe that could have ended lives and lawsuits alike. The nights leading up to that decision had been brutal for Rowan, who spent hours alone in a trailer office poring over load calculations, terrified that raising the alarm would end a career he had worked years to build, yet equally terrified of what silence might one day cost the workers walking those docks every morning. He remembered the moment Elise walked into that trailer uninvited, looked at his marked-up blueprints without saying a word, and simply asked him to explain every red-circled section slowly, as though his answer actually mattered to her. Rowan and Elise grew close during those months, though Augustus initially resisted the match, believing a man without family standing could never belong beside his daughter. Their courtship unfolded mostly outside the family's notice, in diners near the port, and on long walks along the seawall after her father's staff meetings ran late, and Elise often told Rowan that she had spent her whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from her, and that his complete disinterest in her family's fortune was the first thing about him she had trusted. After Elise left the company to build a quiet family life, the distance between her and her relatives only widened with time. When illness eventually took her, Rowan stepped away from a promising engineering career to raise their daughter alone, a decision the Weatherby family read as proof he had never possessed real ambition. What none of them knew was that Augustus had begun visiting Rowan in private, driven by a need to understand why his daughter had chosen an ordinary life over the empire waiting for her. Rowan never blamed him for the coldness Elise had endured growing up. Instead, he showed the old man letters Elise had written years earlier, helping him understand that she had not left the family because of Rowan, but because she refused to let love be turned into another transaction. Over the following 6 years, Rowan quietly helped Augustus review aging construction projects, uncover falsified maintenance reports, evaluate properties at risk of being sold off, meet with workers no executive had ever bothered to listen to, and sit beside him on the difficult days when he refused to let his own children see how much his health had declined. Those visits rarely looked like anything a stranger would recognize as business. Sometimes Augustus simply sat across from Rowan's kitchen table while Tessa did homework nearby, asking questions about steel tolerances and drainage systems that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a proud man's search for a language he could still speak comfortably with another human being. Other nights, Rowan drove 2 hours to sit beside a hospital bed Augustus refused to let his own children know about, bringing nothing but a folder of survey photographs, and the quiet patience of someone who understood that dying men sometimes needed a project more than they needed comfort. Rowan never accepted a single payment for any of it. His only request was that Augustus establish a scholarship fund in Elise's name for the children of the company's laborers, a request Augustus initially waved off as sentimental before eventually signing the paperwork himself, admitting years later in private that it was the first decision in decades he felt certain his daughter would have approved of. The recording closed with Augustus admitting that the family called Rowan failed because he had chosen to leave the race entirely, never understanding that he was the only one among them who recognized there were things worth more than winning it. Helena then laid out the 3 conditions standing between Rowan and full control of the trust. The first required him to identify, before the assembled board that same day, the single greatest threat facing Weatherby Crown Industries. Conrad laughed quietly, confident that a man with no finance background could not possibly answer. Rowan opened the wooden box Augustus had entrusted to him, revealing not cash or jewelry but maintenance records, port survey maps, transfer agreements, an encrypted data drive, and a stack of anonymous letters written by employees over the years. He spoke slowly, without notes, laying each document flat on the table so the assembled executives could see the pattern with their own eyes rather than simply take his word for it, an approach that Augustus himself had once taught him during a late-night review of a bridge inspection years earlier. He reminded the room that a company the size of Weatherby Crown Industries rarely collapsed from a single dramatic failure. It eroded slowly, through 100 small decisions, each one defensible on its own, until the foundation beneath it had been quietly hollowed out by people who understood exactly what they were doing and simply hoped no one would notice in time. He explained that the greatest danger to the company was not a struggling market, but a deliberate campaign to lower the value of its assets so the business could be sold off piece by piece, dressed up in the language of efficiency and modernization, so that anyone raising an objection would sound like they were simply resisting progress. He laid out a timeline on the low table between the seating areas, showing dates and figures that traced a pattern no accident could explain. A pattern of maintenance budgets slashed just before inspection deadlines, of insurance claims quietly settled below their true value, of subsidiary companies registered in office suites that shared the same receptionist and the same unlisted phone line. He pointed to a series of shell companies quietly buying up the company's outstanding debt, every one of them tied back to Ashbourne Dominion Partners, their ownership structures buried under enough paperwork that most auditors would have given up long before reaching the bottom of it. Gideon denied the connection outright, insisting the resemblance between the companies was coincidental and accusing Rowan of assembling conspiracy theories out of ordinary business activity, though his voice carried a thin edge that had not been there a few minutes earlier. The second condition required Rowan to prove which heir had betrayed their father's wishes, and rather than accuse Conrad outright, he requested access to the company's original financial filings. Conrad refused, arguing that Rowan held no formal authority yet, but Helena confirmed that the will granted him temporary access specifically to complete this requirement. Naomi Bell, an internal accountant, was brought in and stood nervously at the edge of the room, glancing at Conrad before Helena reminded her that the will's provisions protected anyone testifying truthfully that afternoon. She explained that she had first noticed the discrepancies more than a year earlier, small inconsistencies in maintenance budgets that grew harder to ignore the longer she looked at them, until eventually she began quietly mailing anonymous packets of evidence to an address she had been given without ever learning whose hands received them. She confirmed that the figures submitted to the board differed sharply from the company's true internal numbers, with several manufactured losses traced directly back to approvals signed by both Conrad and Lucinda. losses that conveniently corresponded to periods when Ashbourne Dominion had quietly increased its position in the company's debt. She admitted she had been afraid to come forward openly, worried that raising concerns through official channels would only get her quietly removed the way other cautious voices inside the company had disappeared over the years, replaced by people willing to sign whatever crossed their desks without asking too many questions. Lucinda, panicked, insisted she had signed at her brother's request without reading the documents closely. The third condition forced Rowan to choose between personal gain and the company's future. He could accept $2 billion in cash and walk away from any claim to control, or he could take on the trust itself, forfeiting the right to sell shares for 10 years while committing most future profits toward protecting jobs, paying down debt, and repairing aging infrastructure. Conrad assumed a man of modest means would take the money without hesitation, and Gideon quietly offered an additional private sum if Rowan withdrew immediately. Rowan sat quietly for a moment, aware that every person in the room expected him to hesitate, and aware too that a version of himself from years earlier, exhausted and grieving and unsure how he would keep a roof over his daughter's head, might have found the offer harder to refuse than he did now. He turned to Helena and asked whether choosing control would increase his daughter's trust fund in any way. When she told him it would not, a small, almost imperceptible smile crossed his face, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who had just confirmed something he already suspected about his own priorities. He declined the $2 billion without a moment's pause, telling the room that the decision had never actually been difficult at all, and that the only genuinely difficult choice he had made that day was walking through the front door in the first place. Realizing he was losing his grip on the room, Conrad shifted his attack toward the legitimacy of the will itself. Producing medical records intended to suggest his father's mental faculties had declined sharply in his final months. He read selected phrases from a physician's notes, describing occasional confusion and memory lapses common to a man in his late 70s, presenting fragments without context in the hope that the room would fill in the worst possible interpretation on its own. He suggested that the entire stewardship trust was the product of an old man's fading judgment rather than a deliberate plan, and for a moment, several relatives who had stayed quiet throughout the afternoon began to nod along, swayed less by evidence than by the simple relief of having a version of events that restored the family's expected order. Gideon claimed openly that Rowan had exploited a weakened old man to seize control of the family's fortune. Lucinda, caught in her own panic, began questioning whether her father had truly been of sound mind when he signed the documents. Helena responded by confirming the will had been signed in front of 3 physicians and 2 independent witnesses, and had been updated multiple times as Augustus's wishes evolved. Still, Conrad had one more card to play, presenting a bank record showing a substantial transfer of funds from Augustus directly to Rowan. If genuine, it threatened to dismantle the image of a son-in-law who had refused every form of compensation. Rowan admitted the transfer was real, and the room erupted into murmurs as Conrad branded him a hypocrite in front of everyone present. Rowan then opened his own financial records, revealing that every dollar had gone toward housing repairs for injured workers and the scholarship fund carrying Elise's name, with not a single cent ever spent on himself. Miles Davenport, a longtime board member, confirmed the fund had been vaguely mentioned to the board before, but that no one had realized Rowan managed it without pay. Conrad pressed further, arguing that Rowan lacked the experience to run a corporation worth tens of billions of dollars, listing off business school credentials and executive titles Rowan had never held, as though the absence of a framed diploma somehow disqualified a man from recognizing a falsified balance sheet placed directly in front of him. He reminded the room that he himself had spent more than 20 years learning the company from the inside, attending every acquisition meeting and every shareholder call since he was barely out of college, and suggested that experience of that depth could not simply be replaced by a stranger holding a wooden box of old photographs. Rowan agreed with him plainly, admitting he had never claimed to know more than the specialists around him. He explained that leadership was never about being the smartest person in any given room, but about building a system where the truth could reach the people making decisions without being silenced along the way. And he pointed out that the very report which first exposed the port's structural risks 13 years earlier had nearly been buried by executives with far more experience than he would ever claim to have. He added that titles and credentials were useful tools, but they had never once, in his experience, stopped a determined person from lying convincingly, and the only real defense against that kind of dishonesty was a willingness among everyone in the room to ask uncomfortable questions before a crisis forced the questions to be asked anyway. Experience, he suggested, meant very little if it only trained a person to protect the institution's comfort rather than its integrity, and he had seen enough men with decades of polish behind them make decisions that cost other people everything while costing themselves nothing at all. He then produced the evidence that would define the rest of the afternoon, a preliminary agreement Conrad had signed with Gideon, granting Ashbourne Dominion the rights to purchase the eastern port the moment Augustus passed away, a deal that would cost thousands of workers their livelihoods. Conrad insisted it was nothing more than a contingency plan. Naomi produced correspondence confirming Conrad had been promised a personal bonus once the sale was finalized. It was then that Lucinda spotted her own name attached to a guarantee agreement she had never willingly signed, and she sat frozen for several seconds staring at the signature block as though it belonged to a stranger wearing her handwriting. She asked Conrad directly, in front of everyone, when she had supposedly signed it, and when he stammered that it had been included in a batch of routine paperwork she had approved during a busy quarter, she reminded him that she had trusted him precisely because he always insisted she did not need to read every document he placed in front of her. Realizing her brother had used her electronic signature to bind her to legal responsibility she never agreed to carry, and that her name would have been the one dragged through regulatory hearings while he negotiated his own exit, something in her expression hardened, and for the first time that day, she turned against him completely, sliding the guarantee agreement across the table toward Helena and asking what it would take to have her name removed from it. Conrad still refused to accept defeat, insisting that even if his own conduct had been flawed, his father had no right to strip control from the family and hand an entire empire to an outsider. Helena announced there remained one final section of the will, a closing explanation Augustus had left for his children. In it, Augustus admitted that he himself had cultivated the toxic competition poisoning his own household, having taught his children that love was something earned through achievement and power rather than given freely. Conrad had grown up believing inheritance was a reward for living according to his father's expectations, while Lucinda had learned to protect appearances long before she learned to value truth. Elise had been the only one who ever walked away from that race entirely. Augustus insisted that Rowan had not stolen his family from his children, but had instead helped an old man understand he had lost them long before this day arrived. He clarified that Rowan had not been granted outright ownership of anything. The assets belonged to the trust, and Rowan remained only its steward, subject to removal if he ever violated its founding principle, a principle stating plainly that no one had the right to sell away the futures of thousands of families in exchange for one family's added wealth. He spoke about the early years of building the company, describing long stretches away from home that he had once justified as sacrifices made for his family's future, only to realize decades later that he had simply traded their presence in his life for boardrooms and shipping contracts, a trade he could never undo no matter how large the fortune grew. He admitted that by the time he understood what he had lost, Elise was already gone, and Conrad and Lucinda had already learned to measure their own worth by the same cold arithmetic he had taught them without ever meaning to. Augustus confessed he had once seriously considered handing everything to Conrad until a final test revealed the truth. He had pretended to consider selling the Eastern Port outright for a quick cash payout, and Conrad had agreed instantly. Rowan had objected, fully aware that his opposition might cost him Augustus's trust entirely. That single moment had settled the decision. In his recorded voice, Augustus called Rowan the only son he had ever had who was willing to let him be angry for a single day if it meant sparing him a lifetime of regret. Rowan lowered his head, allowing a rare flash of pain to show. He had never needed the Weatherby fortune. He had simply hoped once to be acknowledged as family rather than tolerated as an inconvenience. Helena confirmed that Rowan had satisfied every condition set before him. He had correctly identified the threat facing the company. He had proven exactly who had betrayed their father's wishes. He had refused a fortune in cash to protect the company's future instead. Control of the Weatherby Stewardship Trust passed to him formally and completely. Conrad was suspended from every position he held pending a full investigation. Gideon attempted to leave the estate quietly, only to be informed that every relevant transaction had already been forwarded to regulators and independent auditors. Rowan made no attempt to humiliate the man who had spent the afternoon trying to destroy him, stating that Conrad still retained the right to cooperate with investigators and make amends for the damage he had caused. When Conrad bitterly asked how long Rowan had been waiting for this moment, Rowan answered that he had never been waiting to take anything belonging to Conrad. He had only shown up to keep an old man from dying believing everything he built would be sold off piece by piece. Lucinda admitted she had judged Rowan by his clothing, his modest home, and the balance of his bank account, and though she offered an apology, Rowan did not extend forgiveness immediately, telling her plainly that an apology only carried weight when it was followed by action. He called the company's first board meeting under his leadership and, rather than crown himself chief executive, presented a transition plan instead. He proposed appointing an independent chief executive to run daily operations, auditing every existing contract across the company, protecting the Eastern Port from any future sale, establishing an employee ownership program, restoring long-delayed maintenance on aging facilities, and publishing a full account of the Weatherby family's responsibility for what had gone wrong. He spoke plainly to the board about what he expected from each of them going forward, explaining that he had no interest in loyalty performed for his benefit and every interest in honest disagreement delivered early, before small problems became the kind of catastrophe that required a will and a locked wooden box to finally expose. He told them that any executive caught burying a safety report the way the Eastern Port project had once been buried would be removed the same day, regardless of tenure or relationship to the family. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances, unused to a leader who spoke about accountability as though it applied to the room itself and not merely to the workers 3 levels below it. When Miles asked what title Rowan intended to take for himself, he chose the title of chairman of the Stewardship Trust rather than owner of the company, explaining that the distinction mattered more to him than anyone in the room seemed to realize. Gideon requested a private meeting a week later, arriving with a leather folder and the same practiced warmth he had once used to charm Conrad into a partnership that promised to make them both far richer than either deserved to be. He made one final attempt, offering $3 billion to buy Rowan's management rights outright framing the offer as a mutually beneficial exit that would let Rowan return to the quiet life he had always claimed to prefer. Rowan listened to the entire pitch without interrupting, then declined, and calmly slid across the table a copy of the very breach clauses Gideon's own legal team had drafted years earlier for an entirely different acquisition. Clauses that, applied to the current circumstances, voided every remaining right his firm held to the company's assets. Gideon read the document twice, his composure slipping for the first time since the day of the will, before quietly gathering his folder and leaving without another word. The man who once assumed Rowan understood nothing about business watched himself defeated by paperwork. Augustus and Rowan had quietly assembled over years. In the months that followed, Weatherby Crown Industries began to change in ways the business press struggled to fully explain. Investigations confirmed that Conrad had breached his fiduciary duties and personally profited from his arrangement with Gideon. He was not left destitute, but he lost every position of authority within the company and faced serious legal consequences for his conduct. Regulators spent months combing through the shell companies Rowan had first identified in that living room, and the resulting settlements required Conrad to surrender a significant portion of his remaining assets while permanently barring him from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. He avoided criminal charges only by cooperating with investigators in the final stage of the process, a cooperation that came far too late to salvage what remained of his standing among the very executives who once treated him as heir apparent. Old colleagues who had once laughed at his jokes during shareholder dinners stopped returning his calls, and the private clubs that had welcomed him for decades quietly suspended his membership pending review, a small, almost bureaucratic cruelty that stung more than any headline ever could. He eventually took a minor advisory role at a firm far smaller than anything he had once overseen, a position he accepted without complaint, having finally run out of rooms willing to seat him at the head of the table. Lucinda cooperated fully with investigators, surrendered a portion of her financial claims, and redirected the family's charitable foundation toward direct support for the families of company workers, spending her weekends for the better part of a year visiting the same docks and warehouses she had never once set foot in during her decades running the foundation from a downtown office. Her reputation was not restored overnight and had to be rebuilt through consistent effort over time, a process she later described in a rare interview as the first honest work she had ever done in her life. Rowan continued living in the same modest house and kept the repair garage running, visiting company headquarters only a few days each week and refusing both a private estate and a chauffeured car. Reporters found the arrangement difficult to reconcile, with a man now overseeing an empire worth tens of billions of dollars, and one asked directly why he still spent his mornings repairing engines in a small-town garage. Rowan answered that the work reminded him that any large system only functions when someone still understands how its smallest parts fit together. He hired back several engineers who had been quietly pushed out for raising safety concerns over the years, restoring their positions with formal apologies drafted by the very board that once dismissed their warnings. He also ordered a full structural review of every port and facility the company operated, refusing to let cost projections override the recommendations of the inspectors on the ground, a policy that quickly became known among employees as the standard Rowan simply would not negotiate away. The scholarship fund bearing Elise's name expanded considerably under the trust's new resources, eventually covering tuition and housing for dozens of children whose parents worked the docks and warehouses the family had once nearly sold out from under them. Tessa understood only that her father was helping manage her grandfather's company, and Rowan deliberately withheld the full scale of what that company was worth, wanting her to grow up without believing a person's value could be measured by a number in a bank account, and he still insisted she help him change the oil in the truck on weekends, telling her that knowing how to fix something with your own hands was worth more than any title printed on a business card. The announcement itself took place not in a boardroom but on the Eastern Port's main pier, where workers gathered in windbreakers and steel-toed boots to hear Rowan explain, in plain and unhurried language, exactly how the ownership program would function and what percentage of future profits would flow directly into their retirement accounts. A longtime crane operator asked, somewhat skeptically, why a man who now controlled billions of dollars would bother explaining himself to people who had never once been consulted about decisions affecting their livelihoods. And Rowan answered that every decision made without their knowledge in the past was precisely the kind of decision that had nearly destroyed the company they all depended on. At a public event announcing the port's protection, Miles apologized to Rowan for once dismissing him as unqualified, and Rowan told him no apology was necessary for a judgment made without the full truth in hand, adding only that what truly needed to change was the habit of underestimating people before bothering to know them. That evening, the kitchen smelled faintly of the pasta sauce. Tessa insisted on stirring herself, and the small television in the corner played quietly with the sound turned low, forgotten the moment Rowan walked through the door, still carrying the scent of the estate's cedar paneling on his jacket. He set the wooden box, empty now, on the counter beside the mail, and for a moment simply stood in the doorway watching his daughter set 2 plates instead of the usual 1 extra place she sometimes left out of habit for a mother who was no longer coming home. That evening, Rowan came home in time to share dinner with Tessa, just as he had promised. She asked whether the reading of the will had finally made him a successful man in everyone else's eyes. Rowan set the small, star-shaped paperclip down on the table between them and told her it had done nothing of the sort. It had simply forced a room full of people to hear, spoken aloud, what her grandfather had understood far too late in his own life. When she asked what that truth actually was, Rowan explained that failure was never about living in a small house or driving an old truck. Failure was holding an entire empire in your hands while no longer having a single person left who trusted you to protect them. Word of what had happened at the estate eventually spread beyond the family and the boardroom, and for a while the story of the single father who inherited an empire he never asked for became the subject of quiet conversation in towns much like Ashford Bay, where people understood better than most what it meant to be judged by the size of a paycheck rather than the weight of a promise kept, and where a man could spend years being overlooked simply for choosing to stay close to the people who actually needed him. Rowan never gave interviews about the will itself, declining every request with the same simple explanation that the story was never really his to tell alone. The story closed back at the Weatherby estate, where the chair once claimed by Conrad now sat empty at the head of the table. During the very first meeting of the newly reformed board, Rowan again chose the last seat in the room, and when one of the directors suggested he move to the head of the table where he now belonged, he declined, explaining that from the back of the room he could see everyone clearly. The final words belonged to Augustus himself, drawn from the very last recording he ever made, in which he said that the family had called Rowan Hale a failure only because he refused to live the life they wanted for themselves, and that he had chosen Rowan precisely because he was the only one among them who never once wanted to live Augustus's life instead.